You thought kings were noble, majestic, and dignified. Then brace yourself, because what you're about to hear will make your worst nightmares feel like sweet dreams. A monarch whose body was rotting while he was still alive. A stench so vile it spread through entire palace wings. And the women who entered his life, none of them ever left whole. This isn't legend. This is the horrifying truth, the real story of Henry VIII, the most terrifying king in English history. And once you know, you'll never look at a throne the same way again. Chapter 1. A rotting body, still king of an empire. If there's anything more terrifying than a monster, it's a monster with a crown and absolute power. Not just a beast with claws and fangs, but one with servants, armies, and the divine right to kill at will. And in the final decade of his life, Henry VIII was exactly that. A rotting mass of flesh, a decaying soul wrapped in velvet and gold, yet still capable of condemning anyone to death with a flick of his finger. Or worse, a whisper. It all began with a fall, 1536. Greenwich, a jousting tournament. The crowd roared, horses thundered, the young king rode proudly into the lists, until a lance shattered against his armor and the world went black. 2 hours of unconsciousness. In a time when no one understood brain trauma, when being unconscious that long meant you were as good as dead. And when Henry awoke, something else had opened its eyes with him. He was no longer the man England once admired. Gone was the vibrant athlete, the composer of love songs, the golden prince who danced and laughed and wooed the world. In his place stood something far more terrifying, a creature twisted by pain, made monstrous by paranoia, and slowly consumed by rot, inside and out. The injury to his leg seemed minor at first, a bad bruise, a tear in the flesh, but then it refused to heal. It swelled, it split, it festered into something unholy. Black ulcers that gaped open like mouths, leaking pus, blood, and death itself. They emitted a stench so vile it clung to the tapestries and made courtiers gag from 3 rooms away. And as his leg died beneath him, so too did the rest of him begin to unravel. Every morning, a ritual. Servants would peel off the bandages, now soaked through with bodily fluid, and wipe the wound clean. Except there was no clean. Only infection layered upon infection, the skin around the sores turning black, the smell growing stronger, more personal, a scent that belonged to death wearing a crown. Chunks of his body fell away. Flesh, dead, grey, sloughing off like meat from bone, would land with a wet slap on the cold marble floors of the palace. And no one dared react, because to wince, to cover your nose, to turn your head away, was to risk your own. So the servants wiped up the trail, they burned the cloths, they whispered their prayers, and they waited for the next piece of the king to fall. And Henry, he sat on the throne as if it made him immortal, as if the rot made him holier, as if suffering transformed him into something untouchable, divine in pain, invincible in decay. People whispered, even death fears Henry. It won't take him, because it knows he's already dead and still giving orders. But it wasn't just the body that was decaying. His mind split open along with his skin. The king who once sang of romance and virtue now barked orders in the dead of night, accused ghosts of treason and trusted no living soul. He became paranoid, cruel, violent, prone to sudden outbursts of rage followed by eerie, silent brooding. His court feared him not just for what he might say, but for what he might imagine. He saw betrayal in every glance, treason in every cough, poison in every plate of food. He no longer needed facts to destroy you. Just a feeling, a shadow, a dream. When his own body stopped obeying him, he made the world obey in its place. He controlled his court with fear. He controlled his wives with terror. He controlled his country with blood. And so, day after day, night after night, the Tudor court served a king who was already rotting. A monster made of pus and power, whose breath stank of death, and whose eyes burned with the madness of a man still convinced he ruled by God's will. Chapter 2. Marriage, a psychological death sentence for women. In fairy tales, marrying a king is the grand reward, the dream ending, where the heroine is crowned, adored, and cherished forever. But under the reign of Henry VIII, becoming queen was not salvation, it was damnation. Not a death sentence delivered with a blade, but a slow psychological dismemberment. A kind of execution that began the moment the crown touched your head and didn't end until your mind, your will, and your very sense of self were gone. Catherine of Aragon, his first queen, was once the very image of royal dignity. Educated, devout, respected across Europe, she ruled as Henry's equal until he grew tired of her womb failing to produce a son. And when Henry desired another, he didn't just discard Catherine, he erased her. He declared their 24-year marriage ungodly. He claimed it had never existed, branding her not as his queen, but as an impostor. The mother of his child became, in the eyes of the state, a sinner, a liar, a woman who had lived in sin for 2 decades. Her titles were stripped, her daughter taken from her, her dignity suffocated beneath layers of public humiliation and private cruelty. She was forbidden to see her child, Mary, who was used as a pawn, a knife held to her mother's throat. And though she had once ruled England beside her husband, Catherine now found herself locked away, watched, cut off from the world, a ghost in a house she once commanded. When she died, it was alone. No husband, no daughter, no recognition of her name. Her final letter to Henry, soft, desperate, still filled with love despite everything, was never opened. It ended simply, "To the king, my lord and my love, have pity on our daughter." Then came Anne Boleyn, the woman Henry broke the church to marry, the woman he once called his obsession, his desire, his muse. But Anne's tragedy was that she captured not Henry's heart, but his hunger. And when that hunger turned to rot, she was devoured like all the rest. Henry didn't just kill Anne, he shattered her first, piece by piece, friend by friend, family by family, until her world collapsed inward like a dying star. 5 men were arrested, tortured, forced to confess to affairs with the Queen, including her own brother. The charges were false, everyone knew it, but truth meant nothing in Henry's court, only convenience. Anne was forced to watch, to witness the executions of those she loved, to see the faces of men who would die because she once smiled at them. By the time her own death came, there was nothing left to break. No fight, no tears, no rage, just a faint smile. As if she had already died and her body was simply catching up. Then came Catherine Howard. A girl, not yet 20, naive, playful, too young to grasp the danger of marrying a man old enough to be her grandfather, a man whose legs were rotting, whose breath smelled like decay, and whose touch was a slow form of violation. When Henry discovered she had once been with other men before he ever knew her name, he passed a new law. Concealing one's past before marrying the king shall be treason. Not justice, not morality, just the codification of male fragility. Henry's attempt to legislate his insecurity into divine order. Catherine was thrown into the tower, and there, like the others, she was tortured not by chains or knives, but by hope. One day she was told she might be spared. The next, they described in graphic detail how the axe would strike, how the blood would pool, how her eyes might still blink for seconds after the blade hit. She screamed at night, sobbed in the dark, begged for mercy, but mercy was never part of Henry's nature. He wanted her to break, to rot from the inside, just like him. And when she was finally led to execution, they say she asked the guards, "Please, may I practice placing my head upon the block? I want to do it right." That wasn't fear, that was resignation, the voice of a young woman already dead in spirit, practicing her final performance like an obedient child on command. Henry VIII didn't just kill his wives, he deconstructed them. He took everything, identity, autonomy, legacy, and left behind only hollow husks, fit to be paraded, disgraced, and finally discarded. To Henry, marriage wasn't love, it was sacrifice, a ritual, a transaction. A woman gave him her body, her name, her soul, and in return, she received a slow, methodical destruction disguised as royal duty. Chapter 3. A Feast of Rot. When a man loses his mind, we call it a tragedy. But when a king loses his humanity, and still holds absolute power, that becomes a national catastrophe. And Henry VIII wasn't merely losing his mind. He was consuming everything around him, literally and symbolically, until England itself began to look like the scraps beneath his table. His body was decaying, ulcered and oozing. But somehow his appetite grew stronger. He didn't eat to live, he devoured to dominate. Each meal wasn't nourishment, it was a statement. A grotesque sermon on excess, control, and fear. And everyone at court was expected to watch, to smile, and to clap, as if they weren't watching their monarch eat himself into oblivion. 5,000 calories a day, enough to feed a family, enough to arm a platoon. Henry consumed it all alone. A typical dinner: 1 whole roasted pig, 3 to 5 chickens, carp, cod, eels, herring, and lamprey, fresh, salted, stewed, loaves stacked like castle walls, and wine, barrels of it, enough to drown a choir, and that was just what reached his plate. The royal kitchens prepared over 800 different dishes a day, because the king might want variety, because the king might get bored. Over 200 staff working around the clock. Not for the kingdom, not for the starving poor, but for a dying king with a bottomless gut and a paranoia sharper than any blade. And then came the rituals, because feeding Henry VIII was a military-grade operation. Every dish was tested for poison, every cup of water sniffed and sipped, salt had to be pre-weighed, verified, even the forks and knives were inspected, lest someone slip in a death Henry didn't authorize. The cooks were watched by guards, and those guards were watched by other guards, layers upon layers of suspicion, choking the air like the smell of spoiled meat. Meals weren't meals anymore. They were sacraments of fear. Henry believed food had power. Swan would make him graceful. Venison would sharpen his senses. Oysters, mountains of them, would, he claimed, restore his virility, even though his ulcerated legs could barely support his weight, and the stench of his open wounds made most women faint before he even touched them. But he believed, because belief for Henry was power. And if he declared food sacred, it became so. And if he declared his appetite divine, no one dared say otherwise. As famine crept across the countryside, Henry sat on his throne of silver platters. He tore into meat with bare hands, sucking bones clean and flinging the remains onto the floor like a god amused by the suffering of mortals. Leftovers that could have fed hundreds were dumped, fed to dogs, or left to rot. But never to the poor, never. And while his body swelled into a grotesque monument of indulgence, the royal treasury shrank. The excess wasn't just killing his body, it was bleeding the kingdom dry. They say the court grew quiet during meals, not out of reverence, but out of sheer nausea. The sound of the king chewing, the smell of the ulcers beneath the silk, the visible strain of his gut pressing against golden buttons. And still, everyone smiled, because even a raised eyebrow from the king could be interpreted as insult. And insult was often answered with a blade. Some whispered, Henry didn't eat to live. He ate to rule, every bite was a command. Watch me rot, watch me gorge, and pretend this is glory. And so they did. They bowed as he swallowed, they clapped as he decayed. Because telling the king he was killing himself, that was treason, and treason didn't leave the dining hall alive. Chapter 4. The Tower, Gateway to Hell. In most kingdoms, a man awaits trial before a sentence. But under Henry VIII, the process was reversed. The moment you were summoned to the Tower of London, your fate was sealed. You didn't need a crime, you didn't need a trial. The Tower itself was the verdict, because if Henry wanted you gone, the rest was just performance. A carefully staged illusion of justice to justify a slaughter already written. The Tower had once been a fortress, later a royal treasury, but in Henry's hands, it evolved into something far darker. A stage for psychological mutilation, a crucible where identity was dissolved and the soul was slowly peeled away. No one was safe, not rivals, not nobles, not family, not even queens. A raised eyebrow, a whispered rumor, a dream the king didn't like. That's all it took to be dragged through those gates. Anne Boleyn, once the woman for whom Henry defied the Pope and burned bridges with God, was marched into the Tower barefoot, cold stone beneath her, eyes hollow from grief. But before her blood ever hit the straw-covered scaffold, 5 others had already died. One of them, her own brother. They were forced to confess to sins they hadn't committed: adultery, incest, treason, under whips, under screaming, under promises that if they admitted guilt, their deaths would be merciful. But mercy was not part of Henry's design. He didn't want truth. He wanted a story that made him righteous. Inside the tower, death was not sudden. It came in whispers. It came in footsteps. It came in the silence between your own thoughts when you wondered, will today be the day? One morning the guards would murmur, the king may show clemency. That night they would describe, inch by inch, how the axe would split your neck, how long the nerves twitch after the blow, how your blood would darken the wood. You didn't die by steel. You died in pieces, in hallucinations, in pleas for forgiveness, in desperate clinging to lies whispered just to watch you shatter. Catherine Howard died here too, barely 19, too young to understand what she had married, too young to survive what followed. After her arrest, she screamed through the nights, begging, bargaining, praying. Then at some point, she stopped. Not because peace came, but because her mind collapsed inward. On the night before her execution, she made one final request. Please, let me practice laying my head on the block. I want to be sure I do it properly tomorrow. That wasn't fear. That was obedient acceptance from someone whose identity had already been bled out long before the blade touched her neck. The tower wasn't made of stone. It was made of silence. It didn't confine flesh. It dismantled sanity. It was Henry's masterpiece, a place where death was slow, methodical, and personal, where hope was the cruelest form of torture. And those who were spared, they left changed, not as survivors, but as echoes of who they used to be. Chapter 5. A Kingdom of Fear. The brutality of Henry VIII did not die within the cold, blood-soaked walls of the Tower of London. It seeped outward, through palaces gilded in paranoia, through noble houses where whispers were deadlier than swords, through every dark alley, church pew, and quiet dinner table in England. What Henry spread was not order. It wasn't justice. It was pure, silent, inescapable fear. He ruled with suspicion sharper than steel, slept with a loaded crossbow beside his bed, a dagger tucked beneath his pillow, armed guards stationed around him in shifts. And those guards, they were secretly watched by other guards. Because Henry trusted no one, not his counselors, not his generals, not the clergy, not even his own children. He had Princess Mary surveilled, his own daughter, as if her bloodline was more threat than legacy. He planted spies around Elizabeth when she was still a child, barely able to read, but already considered dangerous by the man who had fathered her. The message was clear: no one was safe, no blood was sacred, and no breath could be taken without looking over your shoulder. The Tudor court became a prison made of eyes. Henry ordered the construction of secret tunnels beneath the palace, escape routes should his own throne turn against him. He had peepholes installed in walls to watch without being seen. He planted listening holes in council chambers to catch secrets before they had a chance to escape the mouth. And when that wasn't enough, he assigned spies to monitor his other spies. Paranoia wasn't a side effect of Henry's reign, it was its foundation. The entire court became a beast that devoured itself, a machine of betrayal with gears made from human desperation. Husbands betrayed wives to save their titles. Children informed on parents in the hope of surviving another day. Servants offered up their masters like sacrificial lambs, not out of malice, but from raw, blinding fear. And then Henry created something worse than tyranny. He normalized execution without cause. You didn't need to break a law to lose your head. You didn't need to speak treason or raise a blade. You just needed to appear in the king's bad dreams. One nobleman, loyal for decades, was executed because Henry claimed he dreamed the man betrayed him. No trial, no charges, just a chopping block and blood spilled to calm a paranoid god rotting in real time. Fear became law, silence became a virtue. And survival required more than loyalty, it required invisibility. Everyone at court wore a mask, smiled when they felt terror, laughed when they wanted to scream, agreed when they wanted to flee. Because even kindness could be seen as manipulation, even silence could be spun as defiance, and even truth could be declared treason if it didn't fit the king's mood that morning. In Henry's court, loyalty couldn't save you. Innocence couldn't save you. Love couldn't save you. Only two things could: luck and the terror of being noticed. Chapter 6. Death, the final stage of a rotting nightmare. You might believe that death at last would bring peace, that the oozing, infected flesh would finally be buried, that the rotting soul wrapped in silk and sin would go still. But Henry VIII's death wasn't a release. It was the climax, the final grotesque act of a nightmare that had already lasted too long. In his last days, Henry was no longer a man. He was a sack of meat, bloated and leaking. His legs had swollen to the point that standing was impossible. He could not walk. He could not eat on his own. He could not urinate without assistance. He no longer controlled his body. His body controlled the room, controlled the air, suffocated everything with the smell of rot. Servants didn't walk beside him. They dragged him in a custom-built chair fitted with pulleys and wheels, creaking like a funeral cart made for the living. And every time it moved, chunks of flesh dropped to the floor. Chunks of ulcered, pus-filled skin slapping wet against the stone, leaving behind trails of blood and infection like the slime of a dying beast. Behind him, staff followed with buckets and cloth, not to serve a king, but to clean up the remains of one. They say the stench soaked into the curtains, into the tapestries, into the breath of anyone who entered the room. Even his personal physicians, men who had cut limbs on battlefields and treated plague sores, vomited at the sight of him, not out of weakness, but because what they saw wasn't illness. It was something unnatural, something cursed. Then came January 28th, 1547. At last, Henry VIII died. There was no final prayer, no thunder from the heavens, just silence, and then panic. Because no one dared go near the corpse, not out of reverence, but because the body, engorged, blistered, blackened, was too grotesque to approach. The windows were opened, herbs were burned, and still the stink of royal decay choked the room like poison gas. But even in death, Henry refused to go quietly. As the body was transported to Windsor for burial, sealed in a lead-lined coffin encased in thick timber, the gases of decomposition began to build. The pressure mounted, the wood groaned, the lead bulged, and then it exploded, not a metaphor, not a rumor. The coffin of Henry VIII literally burst. The force of decay ripped it open mid-procession. Putrid liquid and chunks of flesh sprayed inside the hearse. The smell was described as inhuman. People screamed, vomited, fainted. The procession halted, and in that pause, that grotesque final act, Henry was humiliated by the very body he had once believed divine. And then came the worst rumor of all. They say wild dogs were seen licking the blood that leaked from the corpse of the king. The man who had commanded nations to kneel now fed the bellies of roadside scavengers. The symbolism was unbearable, but it was real. The king had become meat. The crown had become carrion. The grave was dug deeper than any other, wider, packed with lime and sealed with stone. But even that wasn't enough. Weeks later, the stench still rose from the soil, as if the earth itself refused to claim him. People whispered, even death could not digest him. The rot inside Henry VIII had outlived the body, had outlived the man, had become a curse on the land itself. And in the silence of his grave, the nightmare echoed on. Chapter 7. The Devil King's Legacy. You'd think that when a monster dies, the darkness dies with him, that the kingdom exhales, that light seeps back into the windows, that the nightmare ends with the shutting of the coffin lid. But Henry VIII did not take his horror with him. He passed it on, not as inheritance, but as infection, woven into the laws he rewrote, the daughters he broke, and the nation he warped beyond recognition. It didn't die with him. It metastasized. His children didn't just live in his shadow, they became it. Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was born into betrayal. She watched her mother, once Queen of England, dragged from grace to disgrace like a worn-out animal, discarded without a second glance. Mary's title stolen, her mother's name erased, their faces banished from court, and Mary learned early, to survive in a kingdom ruled by monsters, you must become one. When the crown finally found her, she didn't wear it with hope. She wore it like armor, like revenge. They called her Bloody Mary. She earned the name. Burning Protestants alive, hundreds of them, publicly, deliberately, because fear, not love, had kept her father on the throne for decades, and Mary had inherited that lesson in fire. She didn't rule with compassion, she ruled with a torch. The same flame Henry had lit, she fanned into an inferno. Then came Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the queen her father had destroyed. Her childhood was a lie stitched together with royal signatures. One day cherished, the next condemned. A princess, then a bastard, a pawn, then a threat, a survivor, always. Elizabeth learned not to feel, only to observe, to analyze every glance, to speak only when safe, to disappear when needed and reappear in power. She never married, she never trusted, and though she ruled with brilliance, with unmatched strategy, she also ruled with the coldness of a woman raised in Henry's palace, where love was currency and trust was fatal. Her court feared her just as they had feared her father. But behind the veil of control was a woman shaped by trauma, not triumph. Elizabeth didn't escape Henry. She was the echo of his mind, refined, restrained, but never healed. The monarchy itself was poisoned. No noble was ever truly safe. Entire families wiped from the lineage books, not by sword, but by suspicion. Not for what they did, but for what someone whispered they might have thought. In Henry's England, even silence was dangerous, even loyalty was treason. If the king woke up angry, laws bent to the will of paranoia. Justice became theater, heads became currency. And that system didn't die when Henry's body did. It endured, it calcified into tradition. And then there was the church, once a divine anchor, now a battlefield soaked in holy blood. Henry hadn't broken from the Pope for faith. He did it for lust, for pride, for a woman. And for that decision, millions paid in blood. After Henry's death, the violence didn't stop. It escalated. Protestants turned pyres into pulpits. Catholics turned altars into gallows. The kingdom was now at war with itself, because one man believed his desire outranked God. Henry's death wasn't the closing of a chapter, it was the opening of a wound. His legacy wasn't lineage, it was a template, a how-to guide on how power corrupts, then kills, then haunts. He showed the world what happens when a man is surrounded only by fear, when no one is brave enough to say no, when the only God a kingdom recognizes sits on a throne and bleeds pus. Henry VIII was not just a monarch, he was a virus that lived on in queens who ruled through fire, in courts that executed for dreams, in churches that burned in the name of a God they no longer feared. His body exploded, but his shadow never left. It lingered in every throne room, every whisper, every act of betrayal that became tradition. He didn't just rot himself, he rotted the idea of royalty, the idea of rule, the idea of England. He was not just a king, he was the warning. A warning that when power is absolute, it doesn't just destroy the body that wields it, it devours the world around it. And it doesn't stop when the tyrant dies. Because what dies in flesh survives in silence. And in England, that silence echoed for centuries.